What if you woke up tomorrow and every dollar in your bank account was worthless? History is filled with nations forced to scrap their money overnight, whether because of collapse, runaway inflation, or political turmoil. Governments have slashed zeros or rolled out new banknotes, promising stability, but instead they unleash chaos. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're exploring what happens when countries switch currencies at lightning speed, and the shocking effects it can unleash on entire nations. When people talk about hyperinflation, no modern story is more dramatic than Venezuela. The nation's currency, the bolivar, has been destroyed again and again by runaway inflation. By 2018, prices were rising so fast that even a single cup of coffee could cost millions. To fix the problem, the government chopped 5 zeros off the currency and launched the so-called sovereign bolivar. Just 3 years later, in 2021, the process repeated with the digital bolivar. Each of these resets wiped out savings, pensions, and wages. The life earnings of ordinary Venezuelans were erased overnight. This all happened while the wealthy and politically connected safeguarded their fortunes by holding US dollars or moving assets abroad. In 2014, more than 90% of Venezuela's export earnings came from oil. This dependency had been built up under Hugo Chavez, who governed the nation until 2013. Oil revenue funded massive social programs, including everything from subsidies to healthcare. This strategy aimed to fight poverty and inequality. But when the global price of oil collapsed, foreign demand for the bolivar crashed with it, and as the currency weakened, the cost of imported goods skyrocketed, dragging Venezuela's economy into crisis. When Nicolás Maduro took over, his solution was simple: print more money. In theory, printing money can help a country weather a short-term economic shock. But in Venezuela, the oil market did not rebound. Production declined due to mismanagement and corruption. International investors lost faith and began pulling out. The bolivar kept falling, imports kept getting more expensive, and every bolivar printed only made the next one worth less. By 2016, inflation had reached 800%, and Maduro's government declared a state of emergency. Just 2 years later, inflation exploded to an estimated 80,000%. Measuring it precisely became nearly impossible. When hyperinflation takes hold, saving in local currency becomes useless. To protect themselves, Venezuelan citizens began converting their money to US dollars. The government responded by imposing strict currency controls, fixing the official exchange rate of the bolivar against the dollar, and making legal currency exchange nearly impossible. But dollars were still accessible through the black market. This created a massive gap between the official rate and what people actually paid on the streets. Soon people found ways to profit from this gap. In 2014, reports surfaced of people crossing into Colombia to withdraw US dollars at ATMs at the official exchange rate. They'd then bring the dollars back across the border, exchanging them for bolivars at a much higher black market rate. Even government officials exploited these differences for profit. This pushed the demand for US dollars even higher, further devaluing the bolivar. To cope, Venezuelans also began smuggling subsidized food and goods out of the country to sell for hard currency. While this helped individuals survive, it worsened shortages inside of Venezuela and drove domestic prices even higher. By August 2018, the bolivar had become so worthless that some Venezuelans found it more practical to use bundles of cash as toilet paper rather than spend it. In response, Maduro introduced the sovereign bolivar, devaluing the currency by 95%. This was the largest devaluation in modern history. He tied the new currency to the price of oil, hoping to convince Venezuelans it was backed by something real and valuable. But within weeks, confidence evaporated. People had no reason to believe in the government's promises, especially with rising authoritarianism, interference in elections, and worsening shortages. Hyperinflation is one of the most destructive forces an economy can face. Few nations experience it, and once the spiral begins, stopping it requires drastic spending cuts and deep reforms. Instead of stability, Venezuela sank deeper. Millions of Venezuelans had no choice but to turn to the black market, flee the country, or endure daily hardship, watching their life savings wiped out again and again with every new currency reset. And Venezuela isn't the only case where one type of currency was completely abandoned for another due to runaway inflation. For years now, Zimbabwe has grappled with runaway inflation and confidence-crushing monetary shocks. Experts agree that restoring a stable currency is vital for economic revival. The World Bank has stated that Zimbabwe is trapped in severe economic turbulence. Its unstable money and distorted exchange rates keep the nation's output far below its true potential. Inflation in the country is nowhere near safe levels. In fact, it is surging, close to 100% in 2025. According to the Reserve Bank, a weakening exchange rate is driving prices even higher, highlighting just how urgent currency stability has become. Back in 2008, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation exploded into the stratosphere, decimating the Zimbabwe dollar to the point of worthlessness. By 2009, the government abandoned the currency altogether, and citizens turned to US dollars and other foreign currencies for survival. For many Zimbabweans, that meant a practical reliance on the US dollar, which today still accounts for about 70% of transactions. The authorities, wary of allowing dollar dominance to continue unchecked, rolled out a multi-currency system featuring both a new Zimbabwe currency called the ZiG, created in 2024, and foreign currencies. The hope is that the gold-backed options would gradually regain trust, but not everyone is buying it, literally. Reports indicate that unofficial traders continue to resist using the ZiG, preferring dollar dealings that feel more stable. Enforcement efforts are reportedly underway, although the informal economy remains powerful. These monetary decisions matter even beyond Zimbabwe's borders. Financial stability is critical for developing industries, luring in foreign investments and reviving confidence in local commerce. For example, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, or PAPS, developed by the African Union and the African Export-Import Bank, offers nearly instantaneous payments in local currencies across African countries. This kind of infrastructure promises to make local currencies more practical and trustworthy. The World Economic Forum has emphasized that PAPS will help African businesses avoid the delays in confirming payments that have long been a barrier to trade. If we go back in time, there's a more familiar case study that sheds light on why currency can be so dangerous both locally and globally. A broken monetary system can lead to disaster and even a world war. Imagine needing a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. That was the daily reality for ordinary citizens in post-World War I Germany. That was when the country's currency, the German mark, collapsed in one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in modern history. The seeds of this disaster were planted during the war itself. In 1914, Germany abandoned its gold-backed currency, assuming the conflict would be short and could be financed through government borrowing. The plan was simple: win the war and force the Allied powers to cover the costs. But when Germany was defeated in 1918, the new Weimar government inherited not just the crushing debts of the war, but also the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was designed to ensure Germany could never threaten its neighbors again. It required reparations to be paid in gold-backed currency, something Germany, now economically shattered, could not easily provide. The reparations were massive, preventing Germany from affording vital imports. The loss of its colonies cut off access to cheap raw materials, further strangling the economy. At the same time, billions of marks that had been hoarded during the war suddenly re-entered circulation. It was a perfect storm. Prices began to climb and the value of the mark tumbled. Before the war, the exchange rate had been just over 4 marks to the US dollar. By 1920, the mark's value had fallen 16-fold. For a brief period, it stabilized at 69 marks per dollar, but instead of reining in the spending, the Weimar government printed even more money to pay its bills and reparations. By July 1922, prices had risen by roughly 700%, and hyperinflation had truly arrived. With too much money in circulation and scarce resources, the mark became practically worthless. The government churned out million-mark notes and then billion-mark notes. By November 1923, a single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. The effects on everyday life were surreal. A common story told from this time recalled people ordering a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks. When they asked for a second just minutes later, the price had already jumped to 7,000 marks. Shopkeepers couldn't restock fast enough to keep up with skyrocketing prices. Farmers refused to sell their crops for money that meant nothing. Food riots erupted in cities. The poor starved, and desperate urban citizens marched into the countryside to loot farms. Law and order simply broke down. The social consequences were devastating. Democracy in the fragile Weimar Republic was undermined at its core as conspiracy theories flourished. Extremist political views, once considered fringe, suddenly seemed like solutions. Out of this chaos, Adolf Hitler and other leaders of far-right movements gained traction, using the collapse of the currency as fuel for their rise to power. To stop the economic freefall, Germany introduced a new currency in August 1924, the Rentenmark, backed by the US Gold Reserve. At the same time, more realistic reparation schedules were being negotiated, helping to stabilize the situation. While government mismanagement is often blamed for the hyperinflation, historians also note that speculators made things worse by short-selling the mark. They bet against Germany's currency and accelerated its fall. Germany's hyperinflation wasn't just an economic disaster, it shattered public trust in democratic governance, destabilized society, and laid the groundwork for one of the darkest chapters in world history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when currency collapses and why stable money is about more than economics. Then there's the more recent case study of what happens when a nation announces certain cash denominations will be worthless overnight. On the 8th of November 2016, Prime Minister Narendra Modi dropped a bomb on the world's seventh largest economy. He announced the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, together making up 86% of all cash in circulation, would no longer be legal tender with just 4 hours' notice. The Indian government used the technical word demonetization to describe the move, but there was something else clearly going on. These notes were not high-value bills by global standards. A 1,000 rupee note was worth only a little over $10 at the time. But in a country where 90% of transactions were cash-based, taking away those two denominations overnight effectively froze the economy. Millions of Indians woke up to find the money in their pockets suddenly useless. So why did the Indian government do this? To flush out black money or untaxed cash that was being exchanged in off-the-book sales and secret property deals. The Indian government estimated that as much as 20% of GDP flowed through this shadow economy, and with only about 1% of the population paying income tax in 2013, the system was clearly being gamed. For the poorest Indians, black money didn't just mean billionaires avoiding taxes, it meant small household savings such as a few thousand rupees tucked aside for a daughter's wedding, a child's school fees, or medical emergencies. For the middle and upper classes, it was far more. It wasn't unusual for half of the value of a property transaction to be paid in cash, with buyers literally showing up with suitcases stuffed with 1,000 rupee notes. To force hoarded cash into the banking system, the government announced that old notes could be exchanged for new 500 rupee and freshly issued 2,000 rupee bills. Citizens could swap up to 4,500 rupees in cash or deposit unlimited amounts into bank accounts until the end of the year. But there was a catch. Any deposit above 250,000 rupees would be investigated by tax authorities. If the depositor couldn't prove taxes had already been paid, the entire amount would be taxed, with a penalty of 200% of the tax owed slapped on top. For many people, that meant losing nearly the entire value of their hidden savings. Many of those hit hardest were small business owners and traders, the very constituency that had propelled Modi into office in 2014, believing that he would supercharge the economy. They now found themselves standing in endless bank queues, watching their working capital evaporate. Yet, remarkably, the policy was initially popular. Most Indians resented the wealthy elites who had dodged taxes for decades. Many were willing to endure what Modi called temporary hardships if it meant seeing tax cheats brought to justice. Still, there were practical problems. New 2,000 rupee notes quickly ran out, and smaller denominations were in desperately short supply. Banks ran dry, ATMs jammed, and for weeks, daily business ground to a halt. Economists also questioned the logic of introducing a higher value note if the goal was to reduce cash hoarding. It seemed like it would create an even more convenient vehicle for corruption. India's broader tax system made the case for reform clear. In 2013, the country's tax-to-GDP ratio was just 17%. This was drastically smaller than the other nations in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, whose average was over 34%. So it's easy to see why the government wanted to pull more people into the formal economy. India's demonetization was meant to complement other reforms, like the rollout of the Aadhaar digital ID system and the new goods and services tax. These were aimed at strengthening compliance and widening the tax net. In one sense, the policy was a success. It was a complete surprise. Billions of new notes had been secretly printed, and even senior cabinet ministers were reportedly kept in the dark. In a country famous for leaks and gossip, pulling off a covert operation of this scale was astonishing. If the plan had been announced early, hoarders would have simply moved their cash into gold or other assets, undermining the entire effort. For weeks, the world watched as long but mostly orderly queues snaked around Indian banks. There was chaos but very little violence. The move tested the patience of ordinary Indians, and while some praised it as a historic strike against corruption, others warned that trust in the financial system could be permanently shaken if shortages dragged on. This brings us to the major question driving these financial decisions and failures. Why do governments switch currencies or even swap them out for foreign ones? The pattern is always the same. Leaders promise it'll fight inflation, cut down on corruption, or shrink the black market. But the truth is, the people who end up paying the highest price are not the wealthy elites who caused the problem in the first place. It's ordinary citizens with cash savings tucked away at home, small businesses trying to survive on razor-thin margins, and workers stuck on fixed incomes. On paper, currency swaps can stabilize the economy. They can make the numbers look tidy for the International Monetary Fund or reassure investors that the government is taking action. But for those living through them, the experience often feels less like reform and more like a punishment that they did nothing to deserve. Sometimes a country doesn't just change its banknotes, it gives up on money entirely. This is called currency substitution, when people use a foreign currency instead of their own for daily life. In these cases, the foreign currency completely replaces the national one. Currency substitution usually happens in developing nations or where governments are too weak to keep their economy stable. During hyperinflation, citizens often ditch their collapsing money and turn to something stronger, like the US dollar in Venezuela or the euro. There are different types of currency substitution, and each tells us something about how desperate the situation is. Full currency substitution happens when a government officially adopts a foreign currency as its legal tender. This can reduce the cost of doing business by eliminating constant money conversions on the foreign exchange market. Sometimes it even encourages foreign investment. But there is a catch. Full substitution usually only happens after something drastic, like a political collapse or an economic meltdown. Basically, full currency substitution is a last resort. Partial currency substitution is a more flexible approach. Here, a foreign currency circulates alongside the domestic one. Locals might still use their home currency for groceries and bus fares, but international business deals or luxury purchases happen in dollars or euros. A good example is Cambodia, where both the dollar and the Cambodian rial are widely used, or Iraq, where it circulates alongside with the Iraqi dinar. Then there's unofficial currency substitution, where the people themselves just take charge. In this case, residents quietly trade their weak domestic money for a more stable foreign one without the government's blessing. Citizens cling to the strong currency for savings and daily use, while trying to get rid of their fragile domestic bills as quickly as possible. In crisis-stricken nations, people might open bank deposits in US dollars or demand payments in foreign cash, and sometimes it's not even about a crisis at all, like when small US and Canadian coins casually circulate across border towns just because it's convenient. But currency substitution isn't without its risks. Governments often hate it because it limits their control. Some governments place strict caps on how much foreign money their citizens can hold, trying to force them to use domestic cash. But once trust in the local currency is gone, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. The bigger issue is sovereignty. When you adopt another country's money, you hand over economic control to whoever issues it. If your economy runs on US dollars, then your fate is tied to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy in Washington, D.C. Imagine your country sliding into a recession, but the US Fed decides to raise interest rates for its own reasons. That could make things worse for you, and your leaders would be powerless to stop it. In short, currency substitutions and swaps are often touted as bold fixes to big problems, but they come at a price: loss of control, massive disruption, and ordinary people left scrambling to adapt. For governments, it's a gamble. For citizens, it's often just another reminder that when economies collapse, it's always the average person who suffers the most. When countries switch currencies, whether it's Germany after World War I, India during its shock 2016 demonetization, or more recent cases like Zimbabwe, the story is never just about money. It's about survival. Government/zeros yank bills out of circulation or even replace their entire currency with the US dollar or the euro, all in the name of fighting inflation, corruption, black markets. And on paper, these moves can stabilize economies. In reality, they almost always unleash chaos on ordinary people. Currency substitution, whether full, partial, or unofficial, offers a quick fix, but it comes with a cost of sovereignty and control. When another country's money becomes your lifeline, you're also at the mercy of that foreign power's economic decisions. And that is the real takeaway. Currency changes may look like bold reforms, but they rarely solve the underlying problems that caused the crisis in the first place. For those living through them, it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like waking up to find your life's work is reduced to worthless paper. One country lost everything overnight when it switched currencies, but now the world's reserve is under threat. Watch why so many countries are abandoning the dollar to see what's driving the shift, or click on this video instead.